Father Laurence will be known to many of you, but for those who are less familiar with his work, he's the director of the World Community for Christian Meditation, the spiritual successor of John Main, and an international speaker and retreat leader. He's active in interreligious dialogue and has worked with the Dalai Lama and leaders of other faiths, encouraging always attention to and the recovery of the contemplative wisdom tradition in the church and in society at large. This morning he'll speak about the nature and perhaps even the paradox of the practice of repetition, which can be, on the one hand, a significant part of healing and stability in spiritual practices, and on the other, a sign of dysfunction in a mental health context. And so I'd like to ask you to warmly welcome Father Laurence.
So, good morning. And a special welcome to Lama Yeshe from Holy Island. My own impression and all the feedback that I have heard from yesterday has been very positive about the conversation and the exploration of this theme of the spiritual dimension of mental health. And although inevitably we're focusing quite a lot on the UK aspect of it in these conversations, what we are, the broader principles, of course, are going to be relevant to many parts of the world. There are many representatives in different parts of the world community here, different countries, and we'll be taking the fruits, the insights of these conversations to our national coordinators in the next few weeks and months. So, and I thought this morning that I would follow up from what I was saying yesterday on what is a fairly universal aspect of life, of the spiritual journey, and of great relevance to the to mental health, and that is this idea of repetition. St. Augustine of Hippo is credited with writing in the 5th century the first autobiography in the modern sense of the word. And he found himself fascinating. He loved thinking about himself and writing about himself. And the story is recited to the greatest listener and the most patient ear in the universe, which is God. God must have given him a very patient listening, and the book is still selling very well. The purpose of telling his story, repeating his story, was to enable him to understand himself better. But because the story was addressed not in a narcissistic way, but beyond himself, to be of use to others, as well as value to himself, the purpose of this self-narrative was to move from self-knowledge to this deeper knowledge that we can call, that he called, the knowledge of God. And for Augustine, only in this knowledge, which is a peaceful resting in God, we are restless, my heart is restless until it rests in you, he says to God at the beginning of this, of his narrative. Only in this peaceful, resting knowledge can anyone find respite from their own restlessness, their own hunger, their own anxiety. In another place he put it like this: a person must first be restored to himself, so that making of himself a stepping stone, he rises from himself to God. Repeating our story, as the therapists among you will know every day in your professional work, repeating our story is a first step in this healing process of coming to self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is not an end in itself. Self-knowledge leads us beyond ourselves to what we might call the knowledge of God, the knowledge of wholeness. Knowledge here doesn't mean just an intellectual, conceptual, rational knowledge. It's a knowledge as is used in the spiritual tradition, really, as Sheikh Kabir made beautifully clear to us yesterday, it's the knowledge of love. We can only know God, according to the cloud of unknowing I quoted yesterday, not by thought, but only by love. So when we speak about knowledge, it's a different kind of use of the word. So I'd like to explore the implications of this insight for the work of mental healing today. The human task of coming to health of soul and wholeness, with particular attention to this idea of repetition. Yesterday I referred to Sigmund Freud, and I must admit, although spiritual people are supposed to prefer Jung, I have an affection for Freud, and I think he came to really tremendous and lasting insights, although he may not have understood his own insights. But that may sound a rather arrogant judgment to make, but sometimes it is the limitations of genius not to know the full implications of what they are discovering. Great artists don't know the full meaning of their works. Anyway, Freud was decidedly anti-religious, which perhaps gave him a clean balance sheet in dealing with the human condition. And he offers us a good starting point today with one of his key ideas, which he developed throughout his career and was fascinated by all his life, which was the nirvana principle. I read somewhere, but I can't remember where I read it, that one day he was watching a child bouncing a ball, just up and down like that. And as he watched this simple action, it began to trigger his thinking about the psyche and how repetition leads to a discharge of the repressed material in the psyche. As we said before, telling our story over and over again. If we only had to tell it once, then the psychiatric profession would be out of work. And you just have to come for one visit, tell the story of your life, and then you're okay. But we have to tell the story repeatedly. In this solitary game, bouncing the ball, he saw a symbol of a process in the psyche by which, through repetition, the repressed elements are released. This is liberation, as all spiritual traditions speak about the purpose of spiritual practice as liberation. And this discharge of the repressed elements leads to a new state of mind. So far we might see a parallel with those insights of the spiritual psychologists of the desert that we discussed yesterday. The desert monks were also aware of the need for repetition, for perseverance, for endurance, for coming back after they had fallen, after they had regressed. They would have to come back again, go back to their teacher, repeat the same material. And these ascetical practices of meditation and the other means that supported it were all part of this repetitive process. And they understood that this work must lead to inner conflict, purification, and a liberation from the power of the demons. Those demons we identified yesterday: greed, and lust, and anger, and pride, and so on. What we would understand is the repressed or compulsive elements entrenched in the psyche. And they also recognize the importance of the spiritual teacher, the Abba or the Amma, someone in whom they could repose absolute trust and confidence. someone whose experience and their own level of integration afforded them empathy and authority in helping others. The difference, though, between Freud and the Desert Fathers is not in the methodology so much as in understanding the meaning of the outcome. What is the goal? What is the purpose? And as we saw yesterday, Freud was very pessimistic about the goal of analysis. It was just about turning desperate hysteria into ordinary human sadness. But we might do a little better than that. The longer he explored and revised his ideas of the nirvana principle, the closer, it seems to me, maybe not to him or maybe not to his scholars, but the closer he seemed to me to come to the kind of optimism and vision of the human goal of wholeness, which underlies the spiritual dimension in the work of healing. Freud saw the repetitive element of therapy as leading to a discharge of energy that illustrates the psyche's search. What Augustine was searching for was this rest in God, finally to find peace in myself. How many therapists hear that? Doctor, I just want to find peace. And Freud's insight was that the psyche searches for this homeostasis, this place of rest. And it's a search for a state free from tension, or of the minimum amount of tension. But in Freud's thinking, it is related to the death principle, to thanatos, rather than to eros, which is the pleasure principle. So this is not what we might at first see, what we might not at first assume. Does it mean that Freud's nirvana principle is some kind of latent spiritual awakening, or spiritual conversion? Well, Freud doesn't go down this track, but he admits that although he was sure he had found a sure principle of the psyche, he did not understand it. It's Freud at his best. He says pleasure and unpleasure cannot depend on some quantitative factor alone, but on some qualitative characteristics. It might be the rhythm, this is Freud speaking, it might be the rhythm, the temporal sequence of changes, rises and falls in the quantity of the stimulus. We do not know. But I think we can see an insight here into a process that is the same process at work from a psychological point of view or from a spiritual practice point of view. And Freud, with great insight, I think, picks up this idea of rhythm, repetition. Rhythm is about repetition, and about rises and falls, the sequence of the human journey. I think what he's illustrating here is, what he's struggling with here, is the problem of measuring the immeasurable. So much of our way of thinking today, both in organization and in medicine or in education, is about quantification, measuring outcomes. And those of you who are teachers, those of you who are in the medical profession will know how exhausting and how dispiriting, how disillusioning that overemphasis upon measuring outcomes can be, how it seems to miss the point of the human element, and really therefore missing the opportunity to achieve excellence by becoming obsessive about measurement and controlling outcomes. And as those of you in organizations will know, nothing is easier than to to, do some creative accounting when it comes to measuring outcomes or doing a report, putting a spin on something which somebody who's too busy to read it properly anyway is going to be satisfied. Yesterday we saw that there are two distinct approaches to meditation. One focuses on the benefits, the physical and psychological benefits, which are well measured. The other also focuses upon the fruits, the immeasurable benefits of meditation, which really are the things that matter. After your cholesterol is taken care of, after you learn to sleep better at night, after you've learned to control your anger, after your blood pressure is regulated, and you're in this wonderful state of health, what then? What do you do with your life? Is that the meaning of life, just to have good cholesterol? We're more likely to evaluate or assess the quality of life by the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, compassion, the ability to forgive, to feel empathy. Now, these two approaches, the benefits and the fruits, the measurable and the immeasurable, are not contradictory or competitive approaches. Each has its place, and one might be the preferred emphasis in certain circumstances. Quite understand that in some circumstances the purely secular or measurable approach to meditation might be the best way of helping someone. But it's more than that. There's always more. In the comprehensive view of wholeness, which sees it as the goal of all human effort, each of these approaches has to be aware of the other. So the spiritual teacher of meditation has to know about these physical and psychological benefits. And the secular person recommending meditation should be aware of this spiritual dimension. It's this mutual awareness of respect, which is what our seminar is working to develop.